Long live the hopes for unified humanity. Yours will be the strength to prevail, not only when victory is within reach, but even when it seems unattainable, when doom looms like a shroud over all. In those times of darkness, my noble children will shine even brighter. The age of conflicts was a period of collapse for human civilization. The empire, which extended throughout the galaxy, did not subdue everyone, but left many crawling on the ground, shattered and bloodied. Hope had been almost completely extinguished, and those who remained, although they knew nothing of the remains scattered throughout the galaxy, considered them lost amid the storm of fire and horror. They entered a downward spiral in which there was sometimes literally the cannibalization of what remained of their ancient galactic civilizations. There were some points of light that clung to the remains of what had been, but their hope of reuniting was more of a myth than a reality. After the decay and ashes, a figure emerged who came to be known as the Emperor of Humanity. Only thanks to his knowledge, determination, and power would humanity survive. His wisdom and vision would become humanity's guide, a light in the darkness for millennia to come. Many figures and institutions during this time would be fundamental to the reconstruction and safeguarding of humanity's future. This key initial period occurs in the late 30th and early 31st millennium, near the end of the M30 period. The Emperor's Thunder Warriors were still forcibly dragging humanity out of the filth in which it had lived. They would achieve this, not by acting as benevolent liberators, but through traumatic force in what was erroneously called the Unification Wars, since the only unifying thing of this era would be the brute force campaign that the Thunder Warriors carried out against the survivors of humanity as they ravaged all of Earth. During this time, the Emperor felt no need or desire for true diplomacy. The days when humanity had seen true civil debate had long ceased, and any dialogue he entered into seemed almost a philosophical or ideological entertainment, purely for his own amusement, before they were all crushed under his authoritarian dictatorial regime. There was only one truly acceptable option that could be taken upon being informed of the presence of the Golden Warrior and his army. Their choice was simply submission or annihilation, and we know all about those who choose to negotiate in absolute terms. The Emperor would fulfill his will without mercy and, in reality, would never sincerely listen to those who presented arguments questioning his right to supreme and unquestionable authority over all human life. The Emperor had the firm and defiant conviction that his path was the only one that could bring humanity out of the darkness that enveloped it, while saving it from itself and its inevitable flaws, which he had seen manifest over millennia. Once chosen to follow this path, it seemed certain that the Emperor would not consider any alternative on Earth. The leaders of human settlements and territories who had too much pride or who had an exaggerated sense of their own importance would hold hasty discussions, raise the expectations of their communities, and deliver bombastic speeches in response to reports of an unstoppable army that, according to them, were undoubtedly exaggerated by propaganda and fear. They would tell their citizens that, with determination and courage, altogether they could defeat this brazen warmonger if he would do the same as so many other warlords who had sought territorial expansion before him over the centuries. But those who had listened to the ignorant promises of their supposed leaders would only discover the enormity of their error and the folly of their pride when they set their eyes on the Emperor's army, his powerful superhuman Thunder Warriors, who stood shoulder to shoulder, forming a visible and unbreakable wall of power. Sometimes this alone would be enough for those who thought too much of themselves, fleeing, screaming from the battlefield in terror. But for others who felt too committed, their misjudgment would become an objective lesson about the consequences, even when their annihilation was assured by the first volley of the Thunder Warriors, whose proto-bolter weapons fired grenade-sized projectiles that left the mostly civilian militia torn to pieces in appalling horror. This would apparently not be enough for the Emperor, who would act to ensure that no one had any doubts or forgot his authority. As an unwavering force of will, his Thunder Warriors crossed the battlefield, brutalizing and crushing those who dared to oppose the will of the Emperor, or simply those who stood in his way in a most obscene way. Heads crushed under boots and fists, eyes torn out, limbs torn off and bodies still alive cut to pieces, amid the images and sounds of the abject horrors that rained down on those who sought to challenge the will of the emperor. Those who survived did so to flee, screaming to tell the horror and ensure that their failed challenge served as a warning to anyone who dared to question or suggest any doubt about who was the true and destined leader of terror, and who would lead humanity through the darkness that enveloped everything in this new era in the years to come. However, even as the Thunder Warriors fought with unconditional loyalty to their task for the Emperor, one of the darkest secrets of the Empire would occur, and to ensure that any record of this was erased and anyone who had knowledge or suggested anything about it was executed. Since the Emperor had long been developing a new weapon with which to lead the next phase of his plan to travel beyond terror and gather humanity from what he considered inevitable self-destruction. The Thunder Warriors, as effective as they were, fulfilled their purpose as the Emperor's hammer, which he used to reforge humanity and turn it from a tribal and divided people into a united empire. But for this to happen, the Emperor needed a new tool of conquest, and this was a role for which the Thunder Warriors were not at all suitable, as it required careful planning, coordination, diplomacy, moderation, and even ideological subtlety. It would be unfair to say that the Thunder Warriors were incapable of possessing such attributes, but they were not suited to assume this role. They were fantastic fighters, but not very good diplomats. And even though in some respects they were more powerful than those who would replace them, their short human life would not be compatible with the galactic campaign proposed by the Emperor. All we can be sure of is that the Emperor would end up massacring the Thunder Warriors using a final battle at the end of his unification wars as a flimsy excuse. This premise is obviously weak, as it seems very unlikely that a force that had never been challenged could be annihilated suddenly and randomly. In fact, some survived the Emperor's purge and lived to tell the truth of their experience. In reality, the final fate of the Thunder Warriors is not clear, nor how it occurred. But it seems that the most likely situation is that the Emperor betrayed his Thunder Warriors and massacred them himself, or that he entrusted the task to his custodian guard, who would survive beyond these early beginnings. Another alternative is that the Emperor was not strictly seeking their extermination at first. Perhaps he had some other plan, but it is possible that the Thunder Warriors learned that the Emperor was creating a new force of superhumans. In fact, we know that they knew it, and seeing these new, more advanced and longer-lived warriors, they felt deceived or betrayed, and some rebelled against the Emperor, which forced him to take action and led to a final battle from which few survived. Only it was a bloody battle, and the Emperor preferred that no one remember it. It is one of the many unfortunate incidents covered up by those closest to the Emperor, and for anyone who dared to talk about it now, it would be an almost certain death sentence. Tragically for the Thunder Warriors, neither the premise nor the trigger for their destruction seem very relevant now, because whatever the cause, it would coincide with the appearance of the Emperor's new warriors, better known, of course, by the citizens of the Galactic Empire of Humanity as the Space Marines, who would eventually reunite humanity through the Emperor's Great Crusade. Their current mission, just as then, is not to lead humanity, but to act as its ultimate defenders and guardians, even if this involves taking measures to protect it from itself. Of course, in the modern era of the Empire, the role of the Astartes has changed at least to some extent, especially now that the Primarch Ultramarines has proactively assumed the role of commanding Lord of the Empire, replacing these stagnant and often ineffective advisors known as the High Lords of Terror. In its broadest sense, although the Astartes remain firm, as they have for some 10,000 years, and fulfill what they were designed for and what they are best suited for, their service in their ineffective advice, known as the High Lords of Terror. In its broadest sense, although the Astartes remain firm, as they have for some ineffective known as the High Lords of Terror in a broad sense. Although the Astartes remain what they have been for some 10,000 years and what best suits them, the supreme defenders of all humanity. The Emperor's great vision for the future of humanity had begun long before his march through old Earth during the Unification Wars. The true and ultimate vision of the Emperor can only be guessed, but it is something that I will probably expand on in the next episode of the Emperor series from here. Although we know that he had planned to create warriors who would gather and lead humanity to a new golden age, one that would allow them to escape the pitfalls and horrors of the past, and, most importantly, disconnect from the fear and mythology that had arisen and dragged humanity back to the Middle Ages throughout the Age of Strife. But one important thing to know is that the 20 legions of Space Marines did not really emerge from vast production chambers as the first ones did later. The first recruits to become Astartes would be subjected to constant testing and eventually recruited from those already in Terra during this time to lead each of their legions and act as their closest commanders. He would create the Primarchs. The origin of the Primarchs is, on a basic level, relatively simple. The Emperor would use his own DNA as a template, fused with other elements that, at least in some cases, appear to be animal DNA, and this allowed him to produce 20 sons who, in turn, would become the models for his new legions. These ultimate warriors would only be surpassed by the Emperor himself and were, for all intents and purposes, semi-divine figures. They were not simply powerful warriors, but were also imbued with traits that largely reflected the Emperor himself. Mysterious genetic gifts of seemingly supernatural power, such as irresistible charisma, persuasive diplomacy, or devastating tactical prowess. This, along with a very prolonged life, meant that they were the closest thing to immortal in what is technically still a mortal human body. They also possessed almost total resistance to diseases and other harmful pathogens, superior healing power, and divine physical strength. A Primarch can easily be seen by ordinary humans, despite their personal protests to the contrary, as a divine figure similar to those of ancient mythology. In addition, each Primarch possesses an individual mastery that distinguishes him from each of his brothers. For example, the Primarch Magnus may have superior psychic power, but not equal to that of the Emperor. But another could exhibit, as I've already said, an unrivaled tactical ability, a mastery of stealth and subterfuge, or a Primarch could be, in every sense, the literal embodiment of war itself. But, for some reason, there is a degree of disparity between the personal gifts of each of them. Some Primarchs, like Greg or Dawn, seem to have received the short end of the stick, given the divine mastery of others in wall construction. But they are people with a history of building family. I will always be one of those who appreciate a good, clean job that points to a bit of war, but at the same time doing a neat masonry job does not seem to be at the same level as a tactical genius of world building like Gilliman, for example, or if you're a Primarch of the Salamander's Vulcan, endowed with, literal immortality as a perpetual. I think whoever was waiting in line after Vulcan thought, wow, he got immortality, what gift will I get? Well, it was Corvus, Primarch of the Raven Guard, imbued with the power to be a master of lightning strikes. He must have been thinking, well, you can't have everything, can you? Although, seriously, the Primarchs were endowed with amazing powers, far superior to mortal capabilities, and were universally superior in all aspects, unrivaled masters in more traditional matters such as war and diplomacy, in stark contrast to those who boasted supernatural traits. But this did not position them in the mind as less capable, powerful, or important. The disparity of personal traits seems to be better interpreted as something that may not have been intentional, because, although the Emperor and his genetic rights were certainly very skilled, the fact is that it is believed that the DNA of some of his Primarchs contained what he described as defective aspects that were not visible at first. Now, it's difficult to know if it happened at this stage, or if it was a later process of complications around genetic degradation and replication, but whatever the reason, these genetic problems would end up manifesting in loyalty and become a problem, especially for Chaos, but also for the chapters of the Second Founding to this day, which points to a possibility of a more experimental aspect. Well, not all the results or consequences of the genetic development of the Primarchs were known to the Emperor. Personally, I think it is reasonable to suggest, and I think it also agrees with what we know of the Emperor, that he did not know with certainty the result of each of his pre-March designs, and that, by using his own DNA, he was probably granting each one a very powerful attribute. But he simply could not know which one nor how successful or stable each pre-March would be. I think it agrees, as I say, with the Emperor, who sometimes seemed to have a defined plan and strategy, and other times simply did what his instinct dictated as the best way to move forward. But before the Primarchs could be fully realized, they were stolen from the Emperor's laboratory and distributed throughout the galaxy, which forced him and his flourishing legions of Space Marines to embark on a great crusade to finally reunite these legions with their Primarchs. It should have been the dawn of a new era for humanity, but instead, despite their inhuman mastery of specific traits and powers, it was ultimately the inherent and inescapable humanity of the Primarchs that was revealed as perhaps their greatest flaw, which ultimately led to their corruption and fall. But the result of this heresy was never the strengthening of the psychic relationship between humanity and those beings that inhabit the darkest confines of war. The imperfect nature of the Primarchs, along with the Emperor's inability to see far enough into the future, or perhaps his inability to distinguish which was the true path forward, led the Primarchs to almost cause the destruction of his new empire and, of course, his own demise. Now, before anyone starts foaming at the mouth, this is, of course, the condensed basic version of events, and I have omitted quite a few elements because their story is so interesting that, for now, a summary is enough. The more detailed version contains the details related to the intervention of chaos, which would lead us to the events in which the powers of chaos would be dispersed. They were still developing the Primarchs of the galaxy, and some were damaged during transport, which would become an additional reason why the Emperor would embark on his great crusade, as he would seek to rediscover the Primarchs, unifying them with the lunar space legions, and, more importantly, returning them under his command as part of the burgeoning Imperium. Now you have to be a little careful here because we're mainly talking about the Space Marines and not the Emperor, and this section of the story could easily extend into multiple tangents completely about the Emperor, his exploits, and his grandiose plans for humanity. But the core of the matter is the journey that is generally accepted to have taken place before the development of the Primarchs. According to all available information, this probably occurred during the dark age of technology, when the Emperor, who was not traveling with that title, of course, along with some other companions, visited the world known as Moloch. And I will also make a digression here because I have often seen people asking about this. How is it possible for the Emperor to be a giant, according to our knowledge of his physical body compared to a star and the Primarchs? How could he remain hidden among ordinary humans during the Dark Age, before this era in ancient Earth? For me, this was quite obvious, and the answer is because he is the Emperor, but also because, with his psychic powers, even before visiting him, it seems reasonable to assume that he was able to hide his true appearance from others. There is a possibility that, even before this visit to Moloch, his physical stature was simply different. I would lean towards thinking that he was capable of changing or controlling his own physique through his powers, although he could also simply cloud people's minds to his true form. You can really choose, because in the scheme of things it doesn't really matter, so Moloch is the reason why the Emperor would enter the Wolf Portal and emerge with even greater powers and knowledge than he previously had. And that is why it is believed that he obtained the advanced knowledge necessary to create his Primarchs. This happened again during the Dark Age of technology. It is speculated that the Emperor made a pact with the Chaos Gods to acquire power and knowledge, but never intending to fulfill what he had actually promised. Perhaps he promised the souls of humanity, or perhaps it was his own eternal soul. After all, he is supposed to have been created through a process that, regardless of the origin story you want to believe, was designed to evade the darkness of the warp. But with all these events, it is something that I think no one can say for sure. The details are the subject of much speculation, but assuming that the Emperor interacted with the dark powers of the warp, what he promised is, for now, quite irrelevant to me. Later, if we have more information about his grander plans and have concrete data, it may be part of a larger picture in its context. But for the moment, it is not the most important thing, since what really matters is that he had no intention of fulfilling it, which, understandably, has clearly angered the entities of chaos. Some believe that the Emperor has been omnipotent since birth, since, according to the story of his origin, he was created by a god to fight against the gods of chaos. It is not the most important thing, because what matters is that he had no intention of fulfilling it, which subsequently, understandably, has clearly angered the entities of chaos. Some believe that the Emperor has always been almighty since he was born as a divine entity, and that he simply needed to enter the warp, not to obtain power, but to acquire additional knowledge of the ethereal realm in order to create the Primarchs, or, who knows, perhaps there's even some other reason still unknown, but I believe that this acquisition of knowledge is certainly a valid and acceptable rationalization, and that the Chaos Gods were simply angered by the Emperor's plan and his ultimate goal, regardless of what he was doing in Moloch at that particular moment, and that this has nothing to do directly with his actions. And it is also suggested that the warp is more than a sea of souls, but actually contains the sum total of the knowledge of the galaxy, or even Ikourio's F-universe of the mechanic. I think she could access it using her built device, which of course was doomed to failure. But he suggested to us that perhaps the Emperor needed to enter the warp through the Moloch portal to recover the knowledge he knew he was going to need for his projects. Perhaps this was the only way to achieve it. We also know that the vacuous gods will unite and work together when they perceive a serious threat in material space, so the Emperor did not need to literally interact with them to trigger the response that would come. No one should consider him a reliable or impartial source. It was the Primarch Horus who told us how, in the dawn of the Great Diaspora, the Emperor traveled here in humble ships and found the gateway to a realm of immortal gods. He offered them things that only a god in waiting could offer, and they trusted him. He gave them a part of his power, and, with that power, he brought science to unravel the mysteries of creation, but the Emperor had no intention of honoring his debt to the gods. He turned against them, took away their gifts, and mixed them with his genetic wits to give birth to demigods. The Emperor condemns the war. Hers are natural, but only that. Let there be no more deaths. The blood of the immaterial realm runs through my veins. It runs through all our veins, because I am the Emperor, you're the sons of Horus. The secret of our genesis was revealed in Moloch. The gateway to that power is located in Nubra Kaliah, far below the mountain rock, sealed and away from the light by a jealous god who knew that one day one of his children would try to surpass his feats. Quoted, of course, from the excellent heresy novel Vengeful Spirit. There are also warp demons who have mentioned these events. Inca, completely ascended, would reveal the primordial truth to Lagur and the accounts of Perpetual, who accompany the Emperor as Olivier Sarika. But, in reality, who can know the truth about these matters at this time? Well, you could say that we will never really know how things happened. Which version of events can be trusted? If the Emperor came back to life today and told everything, could we believe his word? Many would. But it is about the master of humanity, who told stories about his thunder warriors, who were killed in a glorious final battle, when it was probably his own hand, or at least by his orders, who sent them to the grave. The only thing we can assume with some certainty is that the Emperor traveled to the warp portal located in the world of Moloch during what is now known as the Dark Age of technology. Later, during the Great Crusade, Moloch would reconnect with humanity, which subjected it to imperial rule, but the Emperor very suspiciously erased the memory of his first visit, who visited this world at that time, in what appears to have been an attempt to prevent his Primarch sons from knowing or being curious about investigating the existence of the warp portal here. His true motivations for doing so are unknown. He could have done it with the best of intentions, to protect his children from the darkness in which they would later be immersed, or it could have been to maintain his control over the supreme power of the Empire, or who knows what other grandiose visions he might have had. In any case, when it came to a period of heresy, Boros invaded Moloch, also recovered his memory, and entered the portal, which allowed him to acquire his immense powers and ultimately wound the Emperor so severely that even today he still exists in a state of death in life, locked in the golden throne of terror. Although some may consider this narrative quite established, I believe that the causal situations are less important than the results of the Emperor's confrontations in the warp, initially to create the Primaris marks, and then the final consequence in the dispersion of the secondary marks, which led to a staggered reunification and a fractured and slow envy that gnawed at some of the main arcs in his vision of the Emperor, along with what they considered his final abandonment. Could the Misinterpretation and manipulation by the demons related to these events, their cyclical nature as seen by those who reside in the warp, the entire sequence of events related to the Emperor, the warp portal, the marks of the attempts to tear, and its cascade into darkness. All fit into a sequence that I have described previously in our exploration of the warp as a causal time loop. That is, a series of events in time, without a discernible beginning or end. If you missed it, it was covered in episode 1 of The Dark Origins of Chaos. But for the sake of our sanity, I left it there because another question we could ask ourselves is whether the Space Marines were just another tool of the Emperor that he had planned to eventually discard as part of a grander plan, just as he had previously done with the Thunder Warriors. In my opinion, the answer is yes, but I think I will reserve my opinions on both topics for the next installment of The Emperor of Humanity. Music. The original Space Marines were not a vast force of clones that had been developed and were ready to be mass-launched on the galaxy, but were slowly developed along with the Thunder Warriors and the Emperor's Primarch project in the Primarch project in the 30th millennium. The efforts of gene wrights such as Ezekiel Sedin and, of course, Mrs. Astartes were fundamental in the Astartes and Primarch projects. Their extreme efforts, along with those of an entire team of scientists, managed to meet the Emperor's demanding requirements, and they dedicated every last drop of energy to genetically modify volunteer warriors for experimentation and development. Many of them would die, as their bodies rejected the heavy surgery and forced increase, as their bodies were split from top to bottom on the tables of the experimentation laboratories. The scientists worked tirelessly in the Emperor's facilities. Progress was very slow, but everyone hoped to be able to develop stable systems for their new army. The entire development of the Astartes was largely possible thanks to the original director of the Emperor's Biotechnology Division, a woman known as Mar Astartes, who gave her name to the project and the warriors of humanity that would eventually emerge. She was one of the most brilliant scientists that humanity has ever known. Probably only the Emperor surpassed her skill and knowledge, and it was she, and not the Emperor, who is believed to have developed the prototype of the genetic organ known as black carapace, the means by which the Space Marines interact with their armor at a neurological level, allowing them to move and fight as if they were not wearing heavy ceramite plates. But the black carapace is one of the main differences between us, the Staries, and other power armor users, such as the Inquisitors and the Sisters of Battle, the Serratus, who, although they can wear adapted power armor, are not Starteisen, so their bodies cannot interact correctly with the armor and connect to it in the same way. This means that, although they can move in it, it is not as natural or easy, but over time they can learn to use it with good results, and that it is more of an advantage than an obstacle in combat. However, despite all her genius, the black carapace was an extremely difficult organ to perfect, as it did not replicate easily in candidates or sometimes became too aggressive. Only with the combined help of Ezekiel and Dane, later Belisarius, was it possible to stabilize it and make it usable. In fact, Sedin replaced Astar. She is the head of the biotechnical division, and in many respects, this is a tragic story, because although Astarte had been fundamental to the development of the Emperor's best warriors of the Emperor at the time of the heresy of the 31st millennium, at the time of the heresy, she had fallen into oblivion. Her inability to achieve final success in the project led her fellow scientists to consider her a failure, although this was far from the truth. Zidane did not fare any better, although his fate was far from what he had planned for so long. The first studies were not developed in isolation, although they were initially coated with gray armor and assigned what appear to be arbitrary numerical designations. Genetic material from each of the developing Primarchs had secretly been used and implanted in the candidates to transform them from simple, powerful warriors into what we know today as the Space Marines. In addition, during this initial development period, unlike the modern Space Marines of the early legions, recruits were adults and were genetically adapted. Only later was adolescence considered the best age for recruitment, mainly to facilitate the integration, acceptance, and development of the Astartes' genetic seed in their bodies. Because of the way it is often described, people often make the mistake of assuming that there was a clear line between the end of the Thunder Warriors and the beginning of the Space Marines. It is easy to understand why this can happen. I myself have done it in this video by describing the definitive end of the Thunder Warriors and how the Astartes succeeded them, except that this is not the case, as we know it. Initially, there is a kind of mixed force of Proto-Astartes, which makes sense if we think about it, to ensure that the newly adapted warriors were stable and did not go crazy or suffer catastrophic organic failures, for example. However, this overlap is what some might suggest was ultimately the trigger for the fall of the Thunder Warriors, creating suspicion and jealousy. The Thunder Warriors were known to be more brutal and more mentally unstable, or at least that is what we are told. So it is possible that once the Thunder Warriors saw what was coming, they realized that their days were numbered. Who knows how it all ended, but we know that they were exterminated in a great massacre. Some escaped capture, but none are known to have survived to this day, in the 42nd millennium. Once the Proto-Astartes stabilized and formed into some 20 regiments of barely 100 warriors each, the Emperor summoned the warriors of the numerous conquered tribes of Terra to strengthen and build even more his powerful legions of superhuman warriors. The inclusion of genetic material from the Primarchs in each of these 20 regiments unknowingly imbued the warriors with certain characteristics and traits, and it seems that this was at least one of the reasons why the newly formed Space Marines were assigned specific legions to which they were permanently attached in those early days, unlike the strict modern code of the Astartes chapters of the 41st millennium. The legions of the 30th millennium had no limitations on the number of legions, so depending on the needs and pressures during the Emperor's Great Crusade, many of them grew rapidly from hundreds to tens of thousands. Many of these early legions did not immediately carry the distinctive colors that we know today. There were no Ultramarines, Blood Angels, or Imperial Fists, Alpha Legion, or Emperor's Children, but they continued to wear the simple gray armor painted with the symbol of the Emperor and his Thunder Warriors. In addition, not even their armors were uniform, due to the rapid development, since many of them still contained elements of the Thunder armor and were often recycled for the techno-barbarians against whom they had fought, unlike their precursors, the Thunder Warriors. These new Astartes had a great sense of honor and brotherhood, so their armors began to be adorned with marks of achievements and distinction to earn respect and mutual recognition for their exploits. This is where things like purity seals begin to appear, which are a commitment to achieve a certain act on the battlefield, and if you survive and remain intact, you have achieved your goal and a demonstration of your skill as a warrior in the last period of the 41st millennium. This has had religious connotations, but at first it was really a warrior symbol among them, a kind of mark of respect. So this was developing, and each legion ended up having its own livery, theme, and name, which was sometimes granted by the Emperor himself, but for others it was the result of their literal combat style, and all this did not happen at the same time, since there was no set date for the legions. The colors are a great revelation. For example, the Death Guard was originally known as the Twilight Raiders, and its origin was still linked to the period of the Unification Wars, even before the Crusade properly began. Their armor was painted a dull crimson color that represented their preferred strategy of attacking at dusk, and this would later change, during the Crusade, to the bright white of the Death Guard when they reunited with Mortarion. But then, in contrast, you can have something like a regiment like the 13th Legion, which was how we were briefly known while I was still involved in the Unification period as the Warborn. However, as they were disconnected from the affairs of Terra and won their first victories in the Sol system, they were generally known as the 13th Legion. In fact, many legions quickly developed colors that had some meaning, but the 13th took longer to do so. Some, after certain victories, painted a color relevant to a specific battle or victory on their shoulder pads, but it was nothing more remarkable than the fact that they accepted the numerical assignment more as something of their own legion. One of their first general commanders pointed out that, as he had been told, the number 13 was considered a bad omen by the weak-minded and the slaves of the lies of superstition, but that, in the service of the Emperor and the service of the Emperor, we would make it synonymous with redemption and glory. Once the 13th Legion finally reunited with its Primarch, its armor became the familiar blue with gold, which is known to have been seen printed on postcards dating from the period before its isolation in the system. So, for the novices, The design of their armor could originate from events and exploits, or it could simply be chosen by their main AAG as the one that best suited their wishes, something that was often repeated when a legion had built its own system of understanding of the embellishment of the armor, only for any Primarch to erase everything. And this was perhaps more crudely noticeable, as I've already said, with the Dusk Raiders, who were stripped of their terror and their heritage and covered with the white and green of the Death Guard. In addition, as the legions advanced, depending on the success of their campaigns, they needed to replace their losses, in the case of some legions, especially those that had 4 letters in their name. This practice allowed slow-growing fractures to form within their brotherhoods, where those of Earth heritage, who were almost universally loyal to the Emperor, discovered that their new legion brothers had a different and difficult-to-define vision, which became evident in the massacre that followed when the heretics came to light and, by necessity, began to abandon the Emperor by killing most of the original members of the legions, who had emerged from Terra itself and would never have become traitors if it were not for those Marines who only knew loyalty to their Primarch and had been born in the darkness of the galaxy. It was a completely different matter. As their legions made their way into the galaxy, they encountered many new foes. Some worlds would welcome their reunification with a new empire of humanity. Others would resist with all their might. Initially, human worlds were always approached with diplomacy, as it was supposed to be a peaceful and joyful journey of discovery and connection. But for many civilizations during the era of conflicts that had elapsed since their creation, they had completely forgotten that a galactic federation of humanity had ever existed, even though they had actively chosen to have nothing to do with it. Now, other worlds had simply regressed to a barbaric state or a pre-medieval apocalypse. All these situations proved difficult, as each new world required a specific approach. However, when they encountered resistance, they were sometimes heavily armed or had been plagued by Xenos, not to mention the Xenos that the Marines would encounter during their explorations. In any case, the end result was that losses were increasing and the Astartes needed to replace a large number of personnel to reinforce their forces as they moved into space. This broad expansion highlighted something that many had long suspected. There was a powerful link between the Primarchs and the development of their specific legions. At the same time, the reunification of the legions with their Primarchs had put an end to an imminent crisis, as they had been forced to rely on their own gene seed since they left Terra, and this had been gradually losing stability, as happens in so many other cases when a copy of a copy of a copy is made. Each process degrades the quality until, in the end, the material that remains is not adequate or stable enough to make new copies, unless there is a suitable original base as a starting point. That is why, when money is printed, for example, a system of plates is used so that the plate does not degrade in quality, but if a cheaper or less well-made original is used, it is going to deteriorate little by little, and that is the problem that the Astartes had when they went out into the galaxy. They only had their own genetic material, so it became weaker and more unstable, with random mutations, etc., as they advanced in 4 different legions. This was more problematic for some than others. To be absolutely clear, this is not to say that the Marines clone themselves. That is not what happens, but that their base genetic material, their gene seed, was what had to be replicated to form the starting point of the Astartes conversion process. And this leads us to something known as the Gravier theorem. A conclave of the Emperor's genetic rights was well aware of the problem facing the authorities, so they presented them with a suggestion known as the Gravier theorem. This revelation to the Astartes, for what is worth remembering that many scientists claim that the genetic code of the Primarchs could be used to stabilize and expand their current gene seed reserve, and that, by doing so, the mutations of the base genetic code would be significantly reduced. The Primarchs were, in essence, the plate of which, speaking of printing, are a stable constant that allows to produce many more means because their genetic CDs are of much higher quality. However, this discovery of what appears to be a perfect solution is where another of the lesser-known facts about the Emperor becomes apparent. The battles and constant attrition that have taken place, which have been wearing down the Astartes of the legions, so it was necessary to replace them and do it faster and faster. The sensible thing would have been to slow down the expansion to establish facilities and allow the forces to replenish before moving on. But in the eyes of the Emperor, this was not an option. He demanded that there be no truce or slowdown in the progress of the Crusades, which meant that the only option was to create more Astartes and faster than had been achieved through standard gene seed cultivation. So, in addition to the Gravier theorem, they implemented accelerated genetic cultivation techniques along with a previously unknown genetic engineering technology, which would greatly reduce the processing time required to create Astartes from many years to just one. It was the Emperor himself, against the advice of his scientific advisors, who decided to go ahead and force a highly accelerated gene seed cultivation, with a total lack of quality control, along with aggressive psychological indoctrination and mental strengthening techniques. The crux of the matter seems to be that the Emperor was more concerned with the advancement and momentum of the crusade and its success than with the health and well-being of those under his tutelage. So it is not surprising that these processes caused fundamental defects in the novices who had been subjected to poor quality gene seeds. As a result of these processes, many are now aware of the defects in the various chapters of the Astartes. Even in the 41st millennium, some lack the organs of other Astartes due to the degradation of genetic quality. For some, their own genetic code basically became enviable, but few people seem to remember that it was the Emperor of creating the largest legions of Space Marines at an accelerated rate that degraded their genetic quality or concentrated the emotional and physical defects presented by their Primarchs, which played a crucial role in the degradation of the stability and sanity of many Space Marine legions. It is difficult to assess the role these actions played during the Great Crusade and also the extent to which they contributed to what was to come. But it is fair to say that, mainly through the Emperor's own actions, his desire to move forward and disregard the health of his own children, it could be said, perhaps a little harshly, that he ended up with damaged material that would then form the foundations of what would become the horror of the Horus Heresy. Now you surely understand why I have decided to include here an article on heresy, but also that I am going to shorten it considerably. The Horus Heresy is what happens between the early period of the Imperium and the Great Crusade, and then the Second Founding, which is essentially what we could broadly refer to as the modern Imperium. Although in reality, a modern Imperium developed over millennia through a variety of events and different power struggles. Now, why have I decided not to cover in detail one of the most singularly important events for humanity in this era? The main reason is that, as important as this period was in the grand scheme of things, we can actually summarize it relatively simply. But let me start with some anti-imperialist propaganda, and however you look at it, it was actually the Emperor who created the situation of heresy. If he was omniscient, as we are led to believe, we can only assume that this was part of a grander plan. It is difficult to see how this could be so, given what was to come, but if the Emperor is the beginning and the end, it seems to be the only conclusion that can be drawn now. Although the War Master Horus was the ultimate champion of chaos during this time, it was the legion known as the Word-Bearers and Erebus who were the instigators and architects of the heresy. You see, the Emperor had brutally punished the Word-Bearers for perpetuating belief in the worlds they met after their reunification with the Empire, teaching their citizens that the Emperor was basically a god to be worshipped. This was totally contrary to the imperial truth, the rationalist and strictly atheist ideology that the Emperor had intended to be the core of his new empire. Upon discovering the actions of the Word-Bearers, the worlds they had conquered were brutally purged, and they themselves were punished in the most humiliating way possible by the Emperor himself in person. This basically broke the will and morale of the Word-Bearers to such an extent that it left them in a deep state of unease. They wandered aimlessly and, apparently, at some point during this time, their despair was so deep that it was used as a means to manipulate them by the darkness of chaos. The mercy of Erebus and, later, his Primarch Lorgar are then the center of the events of the Word-Bearers, which lead Horus down a dark path of corruption. Thus, through the war portal, he becomes a champion of Moloch and the material for the dark gods. However, even then you must proceed slowly. The Master of the Wall knows that he must wait for the opportune moment and sow seeds of doubt and distrust to know who are his allies and who are his enemies. This subtle bleeding of corruption was first openly shown in what became known as the Eastvan 3 atrocity, where Horus unleashed the exterminator virus by bombing the planet, while the loyalists of 4 legions were on the surface. But when we say loyalists, we mean loyalists of traitor legions, since at that time the legions were still very divided, and the intention here was to eradicate the loyal elements within those traitor legions. This is where Nathaniel Garrow, one of my favorite artists of all time, escapes to deliver the message that Horus is a traitor to the Emperor in person, a mission that does not go as planned. Garrow would later become the first individual to betray the Emperor in person, a mission that did not go as planned. Garrow would later become the first individual we would know as the Grey Knight. His final destiny and survival remain unknown. The heresy finally breaks out during what would become known as the Isstvan V massacre. Half of the known forces of the Genesis Starter are ordered to crush the traitors in Isstvan 5, but unbeknownst to them, Horus has already converted 3 of the legions to his service by ensuring that the 4th was delayed. The first wave of loyalists, Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamanders, landed on the planet, but were betrayed almost immediately. However, the second wave of the Alpha Legion, Night Lords, Iron Warriors, and elements of the Wordbearers, caught them and became embroiled in what would be the bloodiest hours ever in the history of this lineage. After the battle, 3 legions were virtually exterminated, and the Primarch Ferrus Manus was killed by 4 Primarchs and 2 others. Vulcan and Corvus disappear. The heterogeneous band of loyal survivors of the Iron Hands, Raven Guard, and Salamander's legions would become known as the Shattered Legions. As we know, many events take place during the heresy. Imperium Secundus, Titan Death, the horrors against thousands of worlds that are torn apart by doubt, suspicion, and corruption, the Dark Mechanicum, the Solar War, Prospero, Magnus. Of course, everything culminates in the final confrontation in the Siege of Terra, as we, who had rushed into Terra in search of his final battle with the Emperor and a siege of Terra itself that, from any point of view, seemed to have many possibilities of victory for the traitors. The Imperial Fists, with their Primarch Rogel Dorn, had been preparing for this with strong fortifications. The White Scars Legion also prepared to defend the center of the Empire, along with the Blood Angels, with their Primarch and 3 full legions of mechanical titans, not to mention the millions of mortal soldiers, whose number always seems very underestimated to me. The brutal and bloody battle of attrition would begin and last about 55 days. But in what seemed to be the last hours, Horus lowered the void shields aboard his battle barge, and the Emperor, with a contingent of Astartes and marks of PRI, teleported to face the War Master. Unfortunately, when the Emperor arrived at the bridge, scattered throughout the enormous warship in horror, he discovered that the Blood Angels Primarch had already been massacred by Horus. Thus began the legendary battle between the Emperor and his now renegade son, who now walked driven by the force of chaos. It is difficult to know how much of Horus the Emperor fought in this battle and how much he fought against the channeled powers of the gods of chaos themselves, but his understanding of his catastrophic failure, his pain at seeing the fate of his main frameworks and where he had taken them, meant that he would not fight with all his powers, which left a weakness that Horus would exploit to mortally wound the Emperor. Despite this, the Emperor was still able to overcome the defeat. Horus did not just kill him and allow his soul to be reforged by chaos in the warp. The Emperor resorted to his immense psychic power to completely erase Horus from existence and tear his soul so that he would never be reborn. Rogel Dorn arrived too late to be of help and could only save the Emperor by taking him back to Terra so that he could be buried forever on the Golden Throne, a huge machinery that kept the webway tunnels closed that had been the Emperor's secret project. Now all his plans for the future of humanity were destroyed, and he would continue to live, but only as a Carrion King. Even so, these events would have profound consequences for the next 10,000 years. Even now, in these early times, it was murmured that the Emperor's protests that he was not a god, but simply a man, were a secret test for those who could see the truth against everything that the emperor had taught and fought for the next 10,000 years, that they would see that he was not a god, but a simple man. A secret test for those who could see the truth against everything that the emperor had taught and fought for the next 10,000 years, that they would see humanity plunge into a dark age of stagnation, fear, rejection of science, and a renewed belief in mysticism and religion. The dark irony, of course, was that at the very center of this retrograde dissidence and this archaic belief system was the emperor himself, except in a final sarcastic twist, who would be this always zealous faith in the emperor that would not only sustain him for millennia to come, but would also help protect humanity from the darkness of the immaterial. Music. After the Horus heresy, a period known as the Great Purge followed, and this is, as it sounds, a purge of the galaxy of any force and remnant of heretics. The death of Horus had created a power vacuum among the traitors. Not to mention the gods of chaos diverted their scant attention from the affairs of mortals, which led most, if not all, of the heretics to flee at full speed towards the Eye of Terror, the gateway to war, which opened in real space after the almost total annihilation of the Eldar race and the subsequent birth of Slaanesh, which heralded the end of the Age of Strife. Many of the surviving loyalists had to take a deep look at their conscience after the disastrous outcome of the heresy. The father of humanity was a shattered corpse, according to many legions, and often their Primarchs had disappeared or were dead. Thousands of worlds were burned to a state of total anarchy or corrupted beyond salvation. It was a dark period, and the very survival of humanity hung by a thread. It was very possible that they were about to enter a new period of conflict that would eventually shatter everything that remained of humanity. So it was necessary to immediately consolidate the imperial forces and, more importantly, establish stricter lines of control to ensure that the forces that remained loyal could be properly managed and prevent a similar disaster from occurring in the near future. The main brand of the Ultramarines would become the new guardian of the Empire. In order to avoid the problems of the heresy that had been due in part to singular individuals who had come to control gigantic armies of superhuman warriors, it now seemed prudent to divide the legions into smaller groups of 1,000 troops, rookies who would be known as chapters. Chapters, each of them would be led by a chapter master when a Primarch was not available. And this is what is now known as the Second Founding, but it would not be the last. In fact, another 24 foundings would occur until reaching the Ultima Founding, technically the 27th in the last year of the 41st millennium. Roboit Guilliman would also implement the Codex Astartes, a strict code that Marines had to comply with, in addition to providing tactical and organizational structures. It is perhaps the most important work ever done by a Primarch in the Imperium, although not all legions would specifically agree to adhere to the principles and structures established in the code, as some were unhappy with the division of their legions, which is totally understandable. However, they all eventually admitted, in general terms, that this change was the best for the Imperium and humanity as a whole. The code did not contain only simple guidelines, but established important structural disciplines that would change the way a legion operated. From that day on, they were divided into tactical roles with the appropriate brands, which established various doctrines and strategic methodologies. Basically, they distilled the essence of Guilliman into a vast tome that, for the Ultramarines, would become the center of their lives. For other chapters, this devotion to the teachings of Primarch Guilliman was less attractive. They tended to stick to the parts that seemed most logical to them, such as the organizational and tactical elements, but gave a more casual respect to the rest. At the same time that it was so for the Primarch, and therefore had its place in their lives. Another important change during the Second Founding was that these new chapters, instead of crucifying the galaxy as they had done until now, would create a region or sector of space and establish a permanent base of operations. These are often called fortress monasteries, although some chapters would exist as what is known as fleet-based, living permanently on their combat barges, patrolling specific sectors of space, or simply in the galaxy of the Empire, ready to intervene when necessary. After the heresy, many legions had been devastated by the war, and obviously, the Marine Reserve had to be replenished. The vacancies arose after the heresy, since we were one of the least damaged legions. But this was partly because the 13th Legion was already a huge force before the fighting began, and the reason was that the Ultramarines of one of the legions had proven to have one of the most stable genetic seeds, which had made it very easy for them to recruit and increase their numbers in a stable way. While other legions of the Crusade struggled with depleted or poor quality genetic material. So, when the Second Foundation arrived, the old trains had a large number of T-stars that could be redistributed into groups the size of chapters. This was often done quite arbitrarily, but given the importance of creating chapters that maintained strong cohesion, the Marines' perspective was something that had to be taken into account. It is an important reminder that Marines are not clonal troops without free thought, but individual soldiers capable of formulating their own decisions and opinions. And this was actually one of the reasons that led to the fracture of the legions in the heresy. So it was recognized that one way to prevent this from happening again was to concentrate like-minded Marines in chapters where they could freely share their opinions and ideology without it spreading to other Marines and causing friction. I guess, in many ways, you could say that the Astarte chapters were, in a way, a kind of safe bubble where they could practice as they wanted within the limits of the Codex, and without creating internal divisions as might have happened in a legion. The Imperial Fists were a good example of this, as they had Marines who were more fervent followers of the Emperor and were recruited and reformed to become the Black Templars, while those who were more inclined to the order and discipline of the Codex formed the Crimson Fists, and most of the chapters, also known as the Successors, developed their own traditions and champions of great deeds, which were written in the histories of their chapter. They never forgot their origins. Many chapters, when they fought alongside those of the first founding, although there was no technical superiority, the chapters of the first founding, the originals, always maintained an air of command and emblematic figures, such as a chapter master of a chapter of the first founding, who often had significant tacit power and was able to unify the forces of the chapter that, in reality, had rarely interacted, however. Before, in terms of chapter unification, a rather extreme example of this is a very questionable strategy secretly implemented by the renegade Primarch or Dawn of the Imperial Fists. Dawn had never liked the way Guilliman had coldly divided the legions, and even less his own, and most likely he only accepted the new Codex and the second founding because it was essentially what the mainstream dictated. To counteract this, and in his own mind, keep his 7th Legion captains together, he stated a strategy that he would now incorporate into the successive chapters of the Imperial Fists, what is known as the Last Wall Protocol. The theory behind this was that if humanity ever faced a threat as great as that of the heresy, the Imperial Fist chapters would come together. The problem with this is that it goes directly against Imperial protocol, a kind of treason. The reason the Astartes legions were divided was to prevent an individual from wielding such enormous power as an Astartes of a legion. It also seems quite hypocritical, because the idea that a special order is needed to bring the Astartes together in a united front is a bit absurd, if they would do it anyway. No special order is going to make them suddenly join together more, especially when they probably spend all their time fighting in different parts of the galaxy. The reason why the Last Wall convinces me a little is because it seems that it was really a vain project on the part of Rogue called Dawn, who could not tolerate the government dissolving his legion. So he introduced a security mechanism so that, although technically the 7th Legion was dissolved, there would always be a security measure that would allow him to reunite them. In fact, even those in the chapters that came from the 7th Legion had to tolerate the government dissolving their legion. So he put a security mechanism so that, although technically the 7th Legion disintegrated, there would always be a security measure that would allow him to reunite them. In fact, even members of the chapters that came from the Imperial Fists were not very happy with the existence of this protocol. The Marshal of the Black Templars publicly declared that he disliked the activation of said protocol, and that he obeyed the order in protest, as did Sir Baron of the Fists. So, the Last Wall was not even a popular security measure among the forces it was intended to unite, which only serves to further highlight its absurdity. Music. The Last Wall was promoted as the action that saved humanity from the Orcish orgy known as the War of the Beasts, but it seems very suspicious to me, since said action seems to have much more to do with the pride and ego of a renegade or a Dawn, and much less with the security of the Empire. To be fair, I must point out that there were many other legions and chapters that maintained some semblance of unity after the Second Founding, with the Dark Angels being one of the most notable, who, due to their paranoia, prefer not to show their cards and watch each other. But we will talk about all the other major legions and chapters in due course. But despite the fact that Dawn established this protocol to avoid being branded a hypocrite, Robert Guilliman, later in the 42nd millennium, as part of his Indomitus crusade, would of course create a legion of Primaris to carry out his enormous rampage. So it seems a bit hypocritical that he dissolved and basically disintegrated the chapters, and then 10,000 years later when he said, "Well, I guess I need a legionary force, so go ahead." I think it is important to point out that the Robot government basically did the same thing that Rebel Dawn did later, although with a justified need, but nevertheless, it did essentially the same thing as the Last Wall Protocol, only with Primaris instead of standard Marines. Most importantly, the Second Founding was one of the most drastic measures taken in the history of the Imperium, the complete restructuring of all its military forces, and that would set the standard for the next 10,000 years. Not to mention the implementation of the government structure known as the High Lords of Terra, which seemed like a good idea at the time, but which, like almost all bureaucratic systems, would end up slowly suffocating the Empire under the weight of indecision and administration, while strangling humanity with a rope of bureaucracy in the years after the heresy. It was a time of revenge and disorganization of the traitors who sought to evade justice. So it is a miracle that something constructive was salvaged. Some of the chapters established during the Second Founding may now only exist as a scribbled note hastily written on some long-lost administrative document. There was great confusion after the heresy. No one knew who to trust, and so, during the time of deterioration, important things were lost that should not have been forgotten. History became legend, legend became myth, and for 2,500 years, the ring passed from hand to hand. Waiting again, confused here for 10,000 years, the Empire would hold back the forces of darkness surrounding the Eye of Terror with vast fleets and some of humanity's fiercest defenders. The most important of all was Cadia, the gateway to the immaterial. However, Guilliman, even at the end of the heresy, could see that his success in defeating the traitors was nothing that could be called permanent. It was only a matter of time before the dark forces came out of the warp again with enough force to flood the Imperium. If Guilliman wanted to defend humanity, he needed to draw up plans with a broader vision than having a few chapters of Space Marines rejoin a legion. Here is where Primal Element becomes a controversial figure for his decisions, and not only for his choices, but for the use of a controversial figure, someone who was unusual even at that time, but who would later be considered dangerous and even heretical, someone who had an unusual connection with the very origins of the Astartes, a true scientist, an innovator, perhaps the last of the true scientific thinkers of humanity. Guilliman would entrust them with so important a mission that it could determine the very survival of humanity. He entrusted his most valuable project to one called Belisarius. Music. After the heresy of the Second Foundation that followed Herbert Guilliman, he had a vision that went far beyond dividing the legions of the Astartes. He sent Belisarius to develop a new race of space boons that, according to him, will be necessary to face a darkness inevitably awaiting humanity, one that, for now, had only been postponed. The devastation of the heresy had revealed the true danger that humanity faced, and that was much darker than the Xenos of the galaxy, although that could be questionable when the Empire finally encountered the tyrannies. Government always looked to the future. He was a strategist and a visionary politician, so he saw the need to secure the future through the Astartes, in case something happened to him before the darkness returned, which was not long in coming when Guilliman was mortally wounded by Fulgrim and his Ultramarines put him in a state of permanent stasis. However, before that, he entrusted many artifacts of incalculable value, among which the Son Primus Portent stood out, and began his great work to create the next generation of Space Marines, the Primaris. Due to Call's interpretation of his orders, These new Primaris were not released until the end of the 41st millennium and the dawn of the era Indomitus. All the Space Marines developed since the first founding, except those with genetic flaws that do not possess all the organs, had 19 specialized organs originally derived from their Gen Oxy cause. However, the Primaris Marines were implanted with 3 additional organs that, thanks to the use of the Sang Primus Portent, were able to take this great step forward and, subsequently, give rise to this new race of Astartes. The Primaris were finally shown to the Imperium when they were presented to Guilliman after his resurrection at the end of M41. This new race of Marines was deployed as part of what Guilliman had called the Ultima Founding. The Primaries were the last hope for humanity in a galaxy literally shattered by 10 million years of conflict that concluded with the total destruction of Cadia during the 13th Black Crusade of Abaddon. The Indomitus Crusade that followed, as Guilliman's reaction to the forces of chaos now actively invading, saw the Primaris deployed throughout the galaxy to lend their strength where needed. However, the sudden appearance of the Primaries was not well received by everyone, since even now there were those who perceived the Primaries as perversions of the perfection of the Emperor, as genetic aberrations, an insult to the starred eyes of the Emperor's design. Many studies debated between accepting the Commander Emperor's edict, who after all was a Primarch of the Emperor, and a being whose actions or plans they could never question with any fiber of their being, even if they were a chapter without lineage of the Ultramarines. But they were also convinced that an inhuman monster of the Mechanicus like Call could never produce beings that share the mastery that the Golden Emperor of humanity was capable of producing. These prejudices probably only worsened after millennia of retrograde thinking, only worsened with the Ecclesia Keesaw Corps, which observed how the DNA of the Primarch located in the port of St. Primus improved even more, becoming more potent and pure than that used to create the original genetic lines of the existing First Space Marines. This meant that Call was able to produce Primarchs with genetic improvements superior to those of the First, something that, of course, would be unknown to most of the servants of the Empire, but it leads us to something that only we can know, and that is that Call, in his previous life, would probably be the best way to express it, worked on the original Astartes project, and, although the Emperor was involved in it, it was not an individual effort, but the Emperor employed an army of scientists, geneticists, and technicians who helped complete his project, so it is misleading to suggest that no other scientist could rival his work. In fact, I think the Emperor would even encourage someone like Kor to learn beyond this, since, after all, it was the ideology that the Emperor defended. Perhaps it is only correct to say that no one could reach his mastery in the creation of the extraction marks, since these were not mere transhuman genetic advances, but were, for all intents and purposes, demigods. What about the first Sang? What was that magic vessel that Guilliman was able to use to keep the genetic material of the primeval ox so safe? For this, we have to go back to the beginning of the Great Crusade at the end of the 30th millennium. The Emperor was impatient to arrive and bring the first extraterrestrial colony under his control. More importantly, the terror orbiting the moon contained a wealth of knowledge that the Emperor greatly coveted and that would prove essential to his continued expansion. Thus would begin the first pacification of Luna. The cults of the Gen Solana, who called Luna home during the era of conflicts and unification wars, possessed very advanced genetic engineering technology that would be of great use to the Emperor. Despite multiple diplomatic attempts, the genocides refused to collaborate, as did many other worlds during the Crusade. The era of conflicts had been long, and many peoples of the ancient Galactic Federation of Men had developed their own civilizations and had little interest in rejoining a grandiose empire that spanned the entire galaxy. They just wanted to be left alone, which was obviously unacceptable to the Emperor, who was forced to use all his subtlety, his tact, and his delicacy. His solution was to immediately launch 3 proto-space Marine legions on Luna to subdue the world to the Empire, even while the unification wars continued to wreak havoc on Terra's surface. Luna was a strange outpost of resuscitator cults, each of which sold examples of humanity, and each member of the cult was the product of the creation of genetic rights according to the original designs. Resurrected from the dark age of technology, they embodied time and again their attempt to distill the true personification of a single human being into what they considered the truest, ideal form, a specimen of perfection. This seems to have some correlation with the development of humanity during its golden age, and the lunar genetic rites may have been trying to create what has been called the golden men in their underground complexes. These cults had great power, both insular and resistant to imperial truth. If this heterogeneous group of genetic cultists had been any form of standard resistance that the Empire faced during this era, they would have suffered the usual process of ruthless extermination. But as the genetic cults possessed not only the technology, but also the knowledge needed by the Emperor, things could not be handled so forcefully. The Salah continued to respond to imperial requests for alliance with a bold silence, and, as diplomatic threats turned into threats of force, the Cell and I began to prepare for war, which, of course, was a totally futile effort. The first world conquest of the Imperial Man lasted just over 6 hours and was an almost comical success. Faced with annihilation, the matriarch Selenum Helios 254 sent her transmission to Terra asking the Emperor to withdraw his wolves. Their society is shattered, and they are now slaves. Jean writes that Luna would help the Emperor forge the next generation of warriors who would lead humanity's crusade into the stars. One of the critical results of the events that took place here was for the 16th Legion, as they had now earned the name of the Wolves of Luna. The matriarch Helios 254 entrusted one of her genetic witches with what was known as the Magna Mater, in a feeble attempt to protect her knowledge from the Emperor's forces, and was somewhat successful, as she managed to keep it hidden for several centuries, until the heresy reached Terra and Luna was occupied by the traitor forces. The guardian of the Magna Mater was forced to send a distress signal that was answered by the Loyalists, who forced their way to Luna to seize the Magna Mater. A shuriken from the Raven Guard, Oconus, managed to retain the artifact and hide it with him aboard an abandoned station in the void, putting himself in suspended animation to survive alone. Sharkey observed that the station's plaque read Primus Porten, the name by which it would be known in later centuries as a result of the Raven Guard's efforts. He sank in a sporting event. She was brought before her Macrae, Berglamon, the same Primus Porten, employed by Imperial scientists to store copies of the genomes of each of the 20 Primarchs, which were of a purer and more stable quality than any known sample. Most importantly, it was significantly more potent compared to the available genetic material of standard Astartes, which makes sense, as it is DNA from demigod Primarchs. The Primaries are not simply more advanced versions of Astarte, although they had also prepared new armor and weaponry for them that sought to combine the most beneficial elements of the armors of the Heresy period, along with advances in the power armor itself, as well as bolt rifle patterns, new plasma weapons, Redemptor dreadnoughts, repulsor vehicles, and overlord combat weapons. The development of such things again walks that line of acceptability between the beliefs of the Mechanicus and the desires of Guilliman, along with the existence of the ecclesiastical key, pose a problem for Guilliman, who, upon awakening after some 10,000 years, discovered that the Imperium was not as he remembered it, and that some tolerance and diplomacy would be necessary if he wanted to prevent the Imperium from falling into another large-scale civil war. However, the existence of the cause and its effective deployment, as well as its armament, demonstrate that Guilliman, at least, intends to return the Imperium to an era of rationalism and scientific advancement. Guilliman had ordered Call to divide half of the newly awakened Marines into new novice chapters. Each of these new chapters would be composed of primaries originating from one of the 9 original loyal genetic lines. The other half of the primary force created by the Ultima founding would also be divided into 9 forces, but they were commensate to the size of the vast legions of the Horus Heresy era, with one significant difference. These forces were created from a mixture of primary Marines, the 9 loyal ones promoted from the genetic line. Each primary wore the uniform of his progenitor Primarch. Each legion of the children without number was in turn divided into chapter units of 1,000 primaries. Gilliman had ordered the children without number to fight as mixed genetic line units in the hope that the Primaries would demonstrate something that the Emperor had clearly considered impossible with his original firstborn, Marines. Doman hoped that these new Primaries would be able to learn to deal with the different temperaments, points of view, and personalities of their brothers. The government believed that this experiment could prevent another slow fracture of trust and ego that had culminated in heresy. The mixed children without number proved to be a powerful and resilient force during Gilliman's crusade in Dominus to recover the empire of man from the incursions of chaos, and, to a large extent, Gilliman was right in thinking that forces from genetic material from different Primarchs were more than capable of cooperating. However, much of it is likely to do with the stability provided by the Primaries. Nevertheless, the crusade of Gulliman Gulla's crusade had become an arduous task in the 2nd century of M42, and the number of his countless children began to decline. This was not always due to casualties, but often, whenever the crusade encountered firstborn chapters, it struggled to maintain an effective fighting force. The small commander ordered members of the countless children of the same genetic heritage to replace the casualties of the chapters, while the Primaries were clearly able to work together in unity. Gilliman was well aware that this was unlikely in the case of the standard Astartes, and what he did not want was to create more divisions, as there had been many foundings since the second founding initiated by the government. This gave the Primaries great flexibility, but they could support other chapters, for example, the Primaries whose main progenitor was Gilliman himself to become the Rora chapter. Primary means eagle of perdition. Even Ultra means primary in the service of the local dawn. Could be Black Templar, Crimson Fists, Impure Fists, etc. However, this was not the only way they could be deployed. Sometimes, Gilliman simply created a completely new chapter, a primary of the Space Marines of the Children without number, to defend a strategically important Imperial world, or to form a new fleet chapter to patrol a sector of space that did not house worlds of singular importance, but whose defense was worth reinforcing. This was the reason I created my own custom primary chapter. Interestingly, all these primary chapters were not mixed like the primaries of the Grey Shell, but were composed of a single lineage of Primarchs, like the standard chapters. At the end of Gilliman's crusade, only 20,000 primaries formed the countless children, and this is where the government would end the Indominus crusade. He would dissolve the remaining mixed force of primaries upon returning to assist in the plague wars of Ultramar. Some of the primaries formed new chapters, and the remaining countless children were dispersed to already established chapters, where they were expected to pass on the lessons they learned fighting form part of a mixed force of the Astartes comprising different lineages, including units descended solely from their original Primarch. Now, I personally find that Gilliman's conclusions here somewhat contradict the goals he seemed to have set for himself. His intention in creating the unnumbered children was to mix and demonstrate that the primaries could work together where the first ones had not. This seems to have been a resounding success. But in the end, even when creating new chapters composed solely of primaries, he decided that they should all belong to the same lineage. This seems like a very strange counterproductive effort, especially after he had had such clear success. It makes sense that when adding primaries to already existing chapters, these belong to the same lineage to avoid more friction than there is already likely to be, and a wise and admirable effort to make the primaries work together in the first place as a mixed group, but then separate them into chapters of their lineage to then gently infuse the knowledge of their experiences, so that in the future perhaps any new Marine can originate from any genetic template of the loyal Primarchs. So, the government decided to establish that all primary chapters were only of a singular lineage, and that just doesn't make sense to me. Not seeing the real purpose of that when it had already been shown to be something successful beyond simply maintaining lineage. But if you're going to do it anyway, why bother in the first place? It seems like a very strange contradiction, but the Indominus Crusade was coming to an end, and the primaries were now an established part of the lunar space forces throughout the galaxy. However, one thing is certain. The introduction of the primaries means that the galaxy, at such a critical moment, was a big gamble on the part of Robert Call. Space Marines are traditionalists, They don't like change. They adore their history and their origins. Some will take this conservative departure to the extreme for thousands of years. The arrival of the Primaries was undoubtedly attenuated by the news of the return of Primarch to the government as legal commander of the Imperium. It seems very likely that, without this, the consequences could have been much more disruptive and deadly, and could even have created a new internal war within the Imperium. Even so, there were those who, expressly or secretly, saw the incorporation of the Primaries into their ranks as a dilution of their genetic heritage or an insult to their deeply held beliefs. It is fair to say that others had additional reasons to worry, such as the Dark Angels and the Space Wolves. The former had good reason to avoid any external intervention in their affairs, especially the appearance of a loyal Primarch who threatened their secret operations. There were also those who believed that the fact that the Primaries were stronger and genetically closer to the Primarchs was an effort to make them obsolete, as had happened, probably without their knowledge, with the Thunder Warriors so long ago. No logical rationalization could calm these fears. Some even feared that they were simply the subject of a mass execution, which was understandable, given that the Primaries of the Ultima Foundation had been incorporated into the chapters without a voice or vote in the matter, while the former aspirants had been required to sacrifice everything they had known to join the Primaries, who were already here and ready to act. Some raised a more important question, an obvious question that could not be put back in the bottle once it had been expressed aloud. Was it possible for a Space Marine to transform into a Primary to obtain the benefits of the Mechanicus Archaea attack, and at the same time, retain his personality and experience? Money, as master of the Cowgirl chapter, asked Belisarius Call this, and discussed it with her chapter mates whom she was able to meet in person. Call had already considered this possibility and hoped that it would be raised, since he had collected a large amount of theoretical data on the subject and proposed that there would be a 6,016% failure rate until, of course, he could experiment more with starred eyes to perfect the process, as well as have more time to carry out the investigation. There is also, of course, the moral concern of whether such a transformative process should even be attempted at all. Some claimed that this new development was the final destiny of all the Astartes, while others called for caution, and some even whispered about the value of the final conclusion. In essence, the genie had come out of the lamp, and the Primaries were here now. No debate was going to change that, until the question of the transformation of the Primaries was demonstrated successfully or with catastrophic failure. It would never disappear, so was the master of the chapter money, as Calgar, who stepped forward as the first official test subject from the ranks of his storage chapter. The operation to transform Calgar from a traditionalist craftsman into a Primary would be carried out by Cole and his assistants now. Calgar would soon discover that the process of creating the Primaries had not been easy on the test subjects. In fact, many Primary Marines did not enjoy Belisarius' presence. They called torture the visions they experienced while he performed experiments on them while fully conscious, and they would never be far enough away to alleviate their painful memories. The surgery was going to be extensive and agonizing, as Cause seemed more than happy to describe through tedious explicit descriptions of the process. The Primaris were endowed with 3 new organs in addition to the original 9 organs. These are grafted and chemically implanted in aspiring Space Marines. The first is known as Magnificat, which is buried deep in the brain to stimulate growth and intensify the function of other organs. The second is the Aryan Ballast Furnace, which releases a saturation of hypersteroids and corticosteroids when a mortal wound is inflicted on a Primaris to allow him to continue fighting. And the third are these tendon coils, which are Dura's steel cables that coat all the tendons and muscles with a metallic sheath that gives them enormous strength and force, and something that looks like a curious mechanical adaptation. During the traumatic implantation process, Calgar was tied to the marble slabs of the medical laboratory and completely cut from the crown of his head to heal his rib cage, which was fractured, and his physical body was suppressed to the point that life escaped him. Choirs of cybernetic cherubs sang hypnotic and blissful requiems, swinging their aspergillum with the typical Mechanicus incense, as if they wanted to guide Calgar's soul back to his body. The cranial surgeons clicked and murmured and stabbed the tortured flesh of the chapter master for what seemed like an eternity. Those watching from the periphery of the apothecary watched with a growing sense of dread and despair. Had they sacrificed a legendary chapter master just to satisfy their curiosity? The surgeons, with their clicking suits, closed Calgar's wounds, and their hearts were electrically stimulated to bring them back to life. The rebuilt Marnie, like Calgar, emerged from his nebulous and empty soul and returned to the world of mortals. The impact of this sudden awareness led the powerful warrior to break free from his bonds with a roar. His blood splattered the marble slab, and he stood up, staggering. His new implant, the Aryan furnace, provided him with instant energy. The master of the chapter Monet is Koga, who somehow managed to come back from the dead, and, in doing so, demonstrated to his chapter and all the space wounds of the Empire that transformation was possible. Traumatizing, slow, and dangerous, but possible and always appropriate. Historical metaphor. The primary Rubicon had been crossed. Now a new path was opening for all the rookies.